January 17, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. ***. The sand moves like water under the treads of the Panzer IV, fine as powder, golden in the low winter sun. Oberstfreiter Hans Mahler wipes his goggles with a rag that's already gritty, already useless. The leather of his gloves is cracked from the dryness. His tongue tastes of dust and metal. Behind him, the column stretches back toward the horizon, tanks, half-tracks, supply trucks straining against the terrain like animals drowning in quicksand. Somewhere in that line, a fuel truck has broken its axle. Again. It is the third one this week. The desert, Mahler thinks, is not supposed to look like this. When they briefed him in Tunis, they showed him maps with clean arrows sweeping across North Africa, the same arrows that had swept across Poland, France, the Low Countries. Victory was a matter of speed, of mechanized precision, of superior training and doctrine. The desert was just another theater. Another place for German efficiency to manifest destiny. But the desert doesn't care about doctrine. It swallows fuel. It chokes engines. It turns lubricants to sludge and makes every moving part scream. Water, more precious than ammunition, evaporates from canteens before you can drink it. And the distances, God in Himmel, the distances. From Tunis to Tripoli is farther than from Berlin to Paris. The maps in the briefing room made it look so simple, so manageable. Out here, distance is a weapon more lethal than artillery. Mahler has heard the rumors from the forward positions. The Americans have arrived. Green, untested, frightened boys from farms and cities whose names sound like fairy tales, Iowa, Oklahoma, places that might as well be on the moon. The veterans of the Afrika Korps, hardened by years of fighting the British, are not impressed. They remember the first British encounters, the confusion, the panic. The Americans will be the same, they say. Soft. Unprepared. And yet there is something else in the rumors. Something that doesn't quite fit the narrative of easy victory. The Americans arrive with trucks, hundreds of them, thousands of them. They arrive with fuel that seems limitless, with spare parts stacked in pyramids, with rations that include cigarettes and chocolate, and coffee that actually tastes like coffee. They waste gasoline the way aristocrats waste champagne. They throw away equipment that a German unit would repair and nurse and coax back to life because it's easier to requisition new. They are, the veterans say with a mixture of contempt and unease, drowning in plenty. Mahler doesn't understand this yet. Not fully. He understands that his tank has been rationed to 20 liters of fuel per day, that his crew eats the same dry biscuits and ersatz coffee that tastes like burnt wood shavings, that they've been waiting 3 weeks for replacement parts for the radio. He understands that supply is a problem. But he doesn't yet understand that supply isn't just a problem, it's the war itself. The German High Command understood deserts in theory. They had studied Rommel's campaigns, the sweeping movements across Libya and Egypt, the dance of armor and supply lines across vast emptiness. What they hadn't understood, what perhaps they couldn't understand, was that North Africa was merely the prelude. That when the Americans entered the war, they brought with them not just men and machines, but an entirely different philosophy of warfare. A philosophy that said, logistics is destiny. In the fall of 1942, when Operation Torch landed Allied forces in Morocco and Algeria, the German strategists were confident. The Americans would learn, as the British had learned, that the desert was a graveyard for optimism. That you could win 100 tactical victories and still lose the war if your trucks couldn't reach the battlefield. That in the desert, the army with the longest supply line loses. But the Americans didn't play by those rules. They built roads where there were no roads. They laid fuel pipelines across 700 miles of sand. They established supply depots that looked like small cities, with warehouses and repair facilities and bakeries that produced fresh bread every morning. They created a logistical infrastructure so vast, so redundant, so over-engineered that German intelligence officers, reading the reports, assumed they were exaggerated. No one, they reasoned, could possibly be that wasteful, that inefficient, that absurdly abundant. They were wrong. The first clue came from captured documents after the Battle of Sidi Bou Zid in February 1943. A junior logistics officer in the 10th Panzer Division, combing through abandoned American positions, found supply manifests that made no sense. One American armored division, just one, had consumed in a single week more fuel than an entire German corps used in a month. The numbers seemed impossible. The officer brought them to his commanding officer, who brought them to headquarters, where they were analyzed and reanalyzed and finally filed away with a note. Data likely corrupted or intelligence error. But it wasn't an error. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a supply officer with the 21st Panzer Division, began to understand the scope of what they were facing in March of 1943. His unit was stationed near Medellin, preparing for what would become the last major German offensive in North Africa. Weber's job was to ensure that the attacking units had enough fuel, ammunition, and food to sustain operations for 72 hours. It was a logistical nightmare. Every liter of fuel had to be trucked from Tunis across roads that barely existed, through British air attacks, past broken-down vehicles that became roadblocks. He calculated that to supply the offensive, they would need 600 tons of supplies delivered over 3 days. His quartermaster corps could manage, at best, 400 tons. Maybe. Then he saw an American supply dump from a reconnaissance photograph. The photograph was grainy, taken from high altitude, but even so the scale was unmistakable. Rows upon rows of trucks. Mountains of crates. Fuel barrels stacked in formations that stretched for acres. The intelligence officer estimating the supplies in that single dump calculated it contained more material than the entire Tunisia-based German force had received in the last 2 months. Combined. Weber stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he did something unusual for a Wehrmacht officer. He wrote a personal letter to his brother, a professor of economics in Munich. In the letter, later recovered from family archives, he wrote, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting a factory. They do not count costs. They do not calculate loss. They simply produce and produce and produce until the sheer weight of material buries everything in its path. I have begun to wonder if we ever understood what industrial war truly means." The German doctrine, forged in the victories of 1939 and 1940, emphasized mobility, initiative, combined arms, the decisive breakthrough. It was elegant. It was efficient. It assumed that both sides were operating under similar constraints, that supply was a zero-sum game where cleverness and speed could overcome material disadvantage. Rommel himself had demonstrated this again and again, winning battles with inferior numbers through audacity and tactical brilliance. But there was a limit to audacity. There was a point where tactical genius couldn't overcome the simple fact that your tanks were out of fuel, and the enemy's weren't. The Americans, arriving in North Africa, brought with them the accumulated industrial might of a continent that had never known invasion, never known strategic bombing, never had to hide its factories in caves or run its production lines in the dark. They brought the output of Detroit and Pittsburgh, of Oakland and Los Angeles, of 1,000 factory towns that could produce more in a day than entire European nations could produce in a month. And more than that, they brought a military culture that valued redundancy over elegance, overwhelming force over clever maneuver. A German supply convoy was a carefully calculated thing, every truck accounted for, every ton of supplies allocated to precise units with precise needs. Waste was sin. Excess was impossible. An American supply convoy was a flood, a deluge, an avalanche of material that accepted 10% loss, 20% loss, because there was always more coming. If a truck broke down, you didn't repair it, you pushed it off the road and requisitioned another. If a unit requested 5 tons of ammunition, you sent 10. If they needed 50 gallons of fuel, you sent 500. Better to have too much than too little. Better to overwhelm the problem with resources than to optimize your way to defeat. Lieutenant Otto Schneider experienced this philosophy firsthand in April 1943, though he wouldn't have described it in those terms. Schneider commanded a reconnaissance unit operating ahead of the main German defensive lines near the Mareth Line. His job was to observe Allied movements, report on supply lines, and occasionally conduct raids on isolated positions. On April 8, his patrol came across an American supply convoy that had been caught by a Stuka attack. 3 trucks were burning. 2 more were overturned. Standard procedure would be to search for intelligence documents, assess the cargo for anything useful, perhaps salvage some fuel. But when Schneider's men opened the intact trucks, they stopped. Just stopped and stared. The trucks were filled with food. Not the concentrated rations or preserved foods that armies carried, but food that looked like it came from a civilian restaurant. Canned hams. Preserved fruit in syrup. Coffee, real coffee, so much coffee. Chocolate bars by the hundreds. Cigarettes, American cigarettes with names like Lucky Strike and Camel. And stranger things, packets of chewing gum, individually wrapped. Toothpaste. Soap. Razor blades still in their commercial packaging. One of Schneider's corporals, a veteran of the Eastern Front, picked up a can of peaches. He turned it over in his hands like it was an artifact from an alien civilization. "They ship this?" he said. "Across an ocean? Through U-boats? Through air attacks? Peaches and syrup?" Schneider didn't have an answer. He inventoried what they could carry. They took the coffee and cigarettes, some of the canned goods, and then did what doctrine required. They destroyed the rest so the enemy couldn't recover it. But as they set the charges and withdrew, watching the trucks burn, Schneider felt something he couldn't quite name. Not fear, exactly. Not even envy. Something closer to vertigo, the sensation of looking over an edge and realizing the drop is much, much farther than you thought. That night, back at their forward position, Schneider's men shared the coffee. Real coffee, rich and dark, the kind they hadn't tasted since before the war. They ate chocolate and smoked American cigarettes, and tried to make jokes about soft Americans who needed such luxuries. But the jokes felt hollow. Because the question that no one wanted to ask, the question that hung in the air with the cigarette smoke, was, what kind of army can afford to treat these things as standard rations? And if they can send peaches and syrup to the middle of the desert, what else can they send? The answer came in the form of fuel. By May 1943, as the Afrika Korps contracted into its final defensive perimeter around Tunis, German units were operating on fumes. Tanks were cannibalized for parts. Vehicles were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because there was no fuel to move them. Infantry divisions were dug into defensive positions not out of tactical choice, but because they lacked the trucks to redeploy. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin across multiple theaters, could barely maintain air cover. Every sortie was precious. Every gallon of aviation fuel was accounted for. The Americans had built a fuel pipeline. Not a makeshift pipeline. Not a temporary expedient. A permanent, engineered pipeline that stretched from Port Laudy in Morocco across 700 miles of desert to Casablanca, and then forward to Oran and eventually to Tunisia. Steel pipe, laid by engineering battalions, with pumping stations every 50 miles. It delivered fuel faster than trucks could carry it, faster than ships could unload it, faster than German intelligence could believe it. A German logistics officer, captured after the fall of Tunis, was shown photographs of the pipeline during his interrogation. His response, recorded in the interrogation transcript now housed in the U.S. National Archives, was simple. "This is not war. This is industrial production applied to war. You have made war into a factory process. We cannot compete with a factory." He was right. The pipeline was just the visible manifestation of something deeper. The Americans had approached the North African campaign not as a military problem but as a logistics problem. They asked, how do you move 1 million tons of supplies across an ocean, land them on hostile shores, transport them across terrain with no infrastructure, and deliver them to forward units faster than they can be consumed? And then they over-engineered the solution by a factor of 3. They built ports where no ports existed. Deployed floating docks and artificial harbors. Created transportation companies, entire units dedicated solely to driving trucks back and forth, day and night, in endless relay. Established supply depots in depth, so that if one was destroyed or bypassed, 3 more waited behind it. They wasted fuel on scale that would have horrified German planners, but waste was the point. Waste meant redundancy. Waste meant that tactical setbacks didn't cascade into strategic failure. Waste meant that a tank commander never had to choose between pursuing a breakthrough and preserving fuel for retreat. Oberstfreiter Mahler saw this principle in action in the final days before the surrender. His unit, cut off from supply, had been ordered to hold a ridge line east of Tunis. They had ammunition for perhaps 3 more engagements. Fuel for maybe 10 kilometers of movement. Food for 2 days. The battalion commander had explained, with the weary precision of a man doing mathematics on the edge of disaster, that they would fight until overwhelmed, then destroy their equipment and surrender with honor. Then the Americans attacked. It wasn't a human wave. It wasn't a desperate charge. It was methodical, mechanical, inevitable. Artillery fell for 2 hours, steady as a metronome. Then tanks advanced, not in clever sweeping movements but in a straight line, absorbing losses and continuing forward because there were always more tanks. When Mahler's unit knocked out 3 Shermans, good kills, at good range, textbook gunnery, 6 more appeared. Then 12. Then 20. His commander ordered withdrawal. They moved 3 kilometers and took up new positions. The Americans paused, called in more artillery, then resumed the advance. Methodical. Unstoppable. Not because they were better soldiers, but because they could afford to be patient. They could afford to take time, to use ammunition freely, to replace losses immediately. They were playing a different game, one where the rules were written by industrial capacity rather than tactical brilliance. Mahler's tank ran out of fuel that evening. They pushed it into a ravine and set demolition charges. As they marched toward the collection point for prisoners, Mahler saw the American supply line. Trucks, dozens of them, moving bumper to bumper along a road that hadn't existed 2 weeks ago. Engineers with graders and steamrollers and paving equipment, building roads. In real time. Fuel trucks with U.S. Army stenciled on the side, so many fuel trucks that they seemed infinite. And soldiers, American soldiers, standing by the roadside, smoking cigarettes, eating from cans, looking bored. Bored. In the middle of a battle. Because for them, this wasn't desperate. This was Tuesday. One American sergeant, supervising a supply dump, saw the column of German prisoners and tossed Mahler a canteen. "Water," he said in broken German. "You look like hell." Mahler drank. The water was cold, actually cold, in the middle of the desert. He looked at the canteen, standard issue, unremarkable. Looked at the supply dump behind the sergeant, at the mountains of crates and barrels and equipment. Looked at the sergeant himself, healthy, well-fed, his uniform clean despite the dust. And he understood, finally, what Weber had written in his letter. What that corporal had felt holding a can of peaches. What all of them had been circling around without quite being able to articulate. This wasn't a war between armies. It was a war between systems. And one system could put cold water in canteens in the Tunisian desert, and the other could not. The German expectation of desert warfare had been shaped by 2 years of watching Rommel fight the British to a standstill with limited resources. The Afrika Korps had become legendary precisely because it achieved so much with so little. Tactical brilliance compensating for material disadvantage. Speed and aggression overcoming numerical inferiority. The Desert War, in the German imagination, was a pure test of military skill, where the cleverest commander and the most disciplined troops would prevail. They expected the Americans to be another Britain, brave enough, competent enough, but ultimately constrained by the same fundamental logistics problems that constrained everyone. They expected battles of maneuver and attrition where experience and doctrine would tell. They expected, in short, a fair fight. What they got was shock and awe before the phrase existed. An army that brought so much material to bear that tactics became almost irrelevant. An enemy that could absorb defeats that would have crippled a German formation and be back at full strength in a week. A military machine that valued overwhelming force over clever solutions because it could afford to. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. German soldiers, particularly those who survived North Africa and went on to fight in Italy and France, carried with them a quiet knowledge that corroded morale more effectively than any propaganda. The knowledge that every tank they destroyed would be replaced. Every position they held would eventually be shelled until nothing remained. Every tactical victory was temporary because the enemy could simply produce more, always more, until quantity became its own quality. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, Rommel's chief of staff, later reflected on this in his post-war memoirs. We had learned in Russia that material superiority could be overcome by superior tactics and fighting spirit. But the Americans in Africa taught us a different lesson. They did not just have material superiority. They had achieved a state where material was effectively infinite from the perspective of tactical operations. No matter how many trucks we destroyed, the convoys continued. No matter how many aircraft we shot down, the bomber formations returned. It was like fighting the ocean. You could win individual battles against waves, but the tide always came in. The symbolic object that recurs in German accounts of this period, appearing in letters and diaries and after-action reports, is the jerrycan. Specifically, the American 5-gallon fuel can, which German soldiers called the Wehrmacht canister, when it was theirs, and which the Americans had copied from captured German designs and were now producing by the millions. German soldiers would find them discarded by the roadside, empty, thrown away rather than recovered. They would find them stacked in American supply dumps in numbers that seemed impossible. They would scavenge them, prize them, because a good fuel can was valuable. But for the Americans, they were disposable. Expendable. Just another item in an endless stream of supplies where nothing was precious because everything was replaceable. The jerrycan became, in the German imagination, a symbol of American abundance. Not wealth in the traditional sense, but wealth as volume, as excess, as the ability to treat as disposable what others would hoard as treasure. When Tunis fell on May 13, 1943, over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, one of the largest capitulations in military history. Among them were the remnants of divisions that had fought across half of North Africa, veterans who had survived years of combat. In the prisoner of war camps, British and American intelligence officers interviewed them systematically, trying to understand German tactics, morale, command structure. What they found surprised them. The German soldiers weren't broken in the traditional sense. They hadn't lost faith in their training or their comrades. Many still believed in tactical superiority, in the quality of their equipment and doctrine. But there was a fatalism in their responses, a sense that they had been fighting an unwinnable war. Not because they lacked courage or skill, but because the fundamental equation was wrong. Because you cannot, in the long run, defeat an enemy who can replace every loss immediately and who treats 100-mile supply lines the way you treat 10-mile supply lines. One interview, conducted with a captain from a panzer regiment, captured this perfectly. When asked about the key turning point of the campaign, he didn't mention a specific battle or tactical failure. He said, "We knew we would lose when we saw them building roads. Real roads with..." One interview, conducted with a captain from a panzer regiment, captured this perfectly. When asked about the key turning point of the campaign, he didn't mention a specific battle or tactical failure. He said, "We knew we would lose when we saw them building roads. Real roads, with gravel and grading, built to last. We were still thinking about tactical movements, about the next battle. They were thinking about infrastructure. About permanent supply lines. They were planning to stay, to build, to sustain operations indefinitely. And we realized, they can afford to think that way. We cannot." This was the deeper transformation that the North African campaign revealed. The Americans weren't just outproducing Germany. They were outthinking them on a different axis entirely. While German doctrine focused on battlefield excellence and tactical innovation, American doctrine focused on creating the conditions for battlefield success through overwhelming logistical superiority. The Americans understood something that the German high command struggled to accept, that in modern industrial warfare, the factory was as important as the front line. That the engineer battalion was as critical as the tank battalion. That boring, unglamorous logistics could decide wars more surely than brilliant generalship. The Italian campaign that followed would reinforce these lessons. So would Normandy. And in the bitter fighting through France and Germany, the pattern would repeat: German tactical excellence confronted by American material abundance. Skilled defenders overrun by endless waves of supplies and men and equipment. The Wehrmacht learning, again and again, that you cannot win by being better if your enemy can afford to be worse and still overwhelm you through sheer volume. But North Africa was where this truth was first fully revealed. In the desert, where supply lines were visible and distances were measurable, and there was nowhere to hide the fundamental arithmetic of logistics, the nature of the war became clear. The Germans had brought a doctrine designed for quick, decisive campaigns. The Americans had brought a supply system designed for industrial-scale sustained operations. The Germans thought they were fighting a war. The Americans were running a production line that happened to end with the enemy's defeat. As the prisoner convoys moved toward the camps, as the German and Italian soldiers filed past American supply dumps and truck parks and maintenance facilities, many of them experienced what Oberstreiter Mahler had felt drinking cold water from a canteen. Not just defeat, that was survivable, understandable, part of war's fortune, but a deeper recognition that they had been operating under false assumptions. That the war they thought they were fighting, a war of tactics and courage and military skill, was actually a war of production capacity and logistical infrastructure. That they had brought swords to a factory fight. In the years after the war, military historians would analyze the North African campaign extensively. They would study the battles, Kasserine Pass, Medellin, Mareth, the final reduction of Tunis. They would debate tactics and strategy, command decisions and missed opportunities. But the most important lesson wasn't in the battlefield decisions. It was in the supply manifests, in the fuel consumption reports, in the engineering battalion records that showed roads built and pipelines laid and ports expanded, in the mundane mathematics of how many tons of supplies were delivered how far how fast. The Americans had proven that 700 miles of desert wasn't an obstacle if you had enough trucks and enough fuel and enough willingness to over-engineer your supply system. They had demonstrated that logistics, that boring, unglamorous logistics, could be weaponized. That abundance itself was a form of warfare more effective than any tactical brilliance. That if you could deliver cold water to soldiers in the Sahara, you could deliver anything, anywhere, and eventually that capability would grind down any enemy no matter how skillful or determined. The symbolic weight of this truth extended beyond the military sphere. The soldiers who surrendered in Tunisia went to prisoner of war camps where they were fed adequately, sometimes better than they had eaten in months. They received medical care. They saw American camps with electric lighting, running water, organized recreation. And many of them began to understand that the abundance they had faced on the battlefield wasn't unique to the military. It was a characteristic of the society that produced that military. That America wasn't just temporarily outproducing Germany for war purposes, it was fundamentally more productive, more wealthy, more capable of sustaining complex logistics over vast distances. This realization would shape post-war Germany in ways that historians are still tracing. The Marshall Plan, with its emphasis on rebuilding European productive capacity, made more sense to German leaders who had seen American logistical capability in action. The integration of Western Europe into American-led security structures was easier to accept for a generation of military officers who understood that they couldn't match American material power. Even the shape of modern European social democracy owes something to the recognition that America's productive abundance wasn't just military. It was systemic, economic, social. But in May of 1943, as the last German soldiers surrendered in North Africa, these implications were still years away from being understood. What was immediately clear was simpler and more devastating: the Desert War was over. The Afrika Korps, legendary for its victories against impossible odds, had finally met an enemy that couldn't be outmaneuvered because it didn't need to maneuver. It simply advanced slowly, methodically, backed by a supply system so robust that it turned the entire strategic calculation upside down. Lieutenant Werner Kessler, a logistics officer captured at Tunis, wrote in his diary on the day of surrender, "We thought we understood modern war. We thought we had learned its lessons in Poland and France. We were wrong. Modern war isn't about the first 3 months of campaign. It's about the next 3 years of production. It's about which society can build more factories, train more drivers, lay more pipeline, move more tons of steel across more miles of ocean and desert and mountain. The Americans didn't beat us in North Africa. They outproduced us. They outsupplied us. They made supply itself into a weapon we couldn't counter. And if they can do this in the desert, what will they do in Europe? It was a prescient question. The answer would come on the beaches of Normandy, in the hedgerows of France, in the Rhine crossings and the final collapse of the Third Reich. But the pattern was established in Africa, among the sand and the heat and the endless columns of American trucks carrying supplies that seemed to materialize out of thin air. The jerrycan remains. Small, practical, unremarkable. Millions of them were produced. Many still exist, in museums and military surplus stores and collectors' garages. And each one carries within it the memory of a lesson learned in the hardest possible way, that war in the industrial age isn't won by the army with the best tanks or the smartest generals or the bravest soldiers. It's won by the nation that can keep those tanks fueled, those generals informed, those soldiers fed and supplied and reinforced faster than they can be killed. The Germans thought desert warfare was unwinnable because they understood deserts as places of scarcity. Places where supply was everything and supply was impossible. They were half right. Supply was everything. But for an army backed by Detroit and Pittsburgh, by the industrial heartland of America running at full capacity, supply wasn't. Impossible. It was just expensive. And America could afford expensive. In the end, that was the real lesson of North Africa. Not that American soldiers were better or worse than German soldiers, though both showed moments of excellence and moments of failure. Not that American tactics were superior or inferior, though they evolved rapidly from the disasters of Kasserine to the systematic reduction of Tunis. The lesson was simpler and more profound, that in a war of production, the producer with the greatest capacity wins. And that modern warfare had become, irrevocably and permanently, a contest of productive capacity first and military skill second. The sun sets over the desert in shades of orange and red and purple. The supply convoys continue, headlights cutting through the dusk. Somewhere an engine turns over. Somewhere fuel flows through 700 miles of pipeline. Somewhere a logistics officer checks a manifest and orders another 1,000 tons of supplies. The desert, eternal and indifferent, watches. It has seen empires rise and fall, has buried armies in its sand for thousands of years. It will still be here when the trucks are gone and the pipelines are rust, and the war is just another layer in the archaeological record. But for now, in this moment, the desert has taught its lesson. Abundance is power. Logistics is destiny. And the army that can turn sand into roads and distance into mere inconvenience is the army that writes the future. The Germans learned this lesson at terrible cost. The world learned it by watching. And modern warfare, from that moment forward, would never be the same.